Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and I'm always honored to have with us time when we get to sit down with Dr. Tim Murphy. He's a licensed psychologist, a clinical director there at Fortis Future, which is a center focusing on the care of veterans, military, and first responders with PTSD. Dr. Murphy was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, Pennsylvania's 18th congressional district, 8 times. He's the author of The Christ Cure. I can't say enough about this resource. 10 biblical ways to heal from trauma, tragedy, and PTSD. And let me say to our viewers and listeners, and anybody that leads people, this is a book I think you should have and read. There's so much in there that you can learn from and how dealing and treating with people who suffer with this, this emotion. Dr. Murphy, as always, friend, good to see you. How are you? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Great to be with you again, Perry.
Thank you. Did you suffer mental stress when you were in Congress?
Oh. Is there oxygen in the air? Of course. Yeah, it's a very, very stressful job. I mean, not only because you're working with 435 people in the House and 700,000 people back in your district in a media frenzy, trying to find ways of make things work. You know, a lot of us go into that bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, naive and say, I'm going to make these things happen. You realize I've got to convince a lot of people that what I'm proposing is a good idea, while they're also trying to convince me that what way they want to do is a good idea. And then you got to go through the Senate and through the White House. And within all that, the media, quite frankly, is oftentimes not interested at all in what you're trying to do, but they're interested in what you're doing and lurking around and trying to find weak spots and poke away at that, because that's where they get their clickbait. So it's very, very stressful. Plus, you're away from family. You don't see your, I didn't see my daughter, my wife much for years, and that's a very stressful situation to be in, sleeping on my couch in my office. But you know what? It's a small price to pay. Try to work at it. It takes its toll on a lot of people, and we have to remember that when people start criticizing elected officials and say they're terrible, they're vermin, they're not. We may disagree on what we stand for, but it's a tough job. I'm not complaining. Other people have tougher jobs, but it's not an easy job.
Well, thank you for your service. I'm glad you got healed from it, and you're on doing what God called you to do. So,
yeah.
You recently wrote an article about reforming America's mental health system, and I think the whole topic of mental health now has become this catch-all term, and I don't know if that's being fair. How would you describe, basically, mental health?
That's the key question. There's a difference between mental health and mental illness, but oftentimes they're merged together. And people talk about we have a mental health problem in America. No, we have a mental illness problem in America. To talk about mental health and mental illness mingling them is like saying, well, we want to talk about lung health or skin health, but never talk about cancer. Well, cancer's too tough. We're not going to talk about that. So we're only going to focus on the health. And what that means is a lot of people miss the boat. There's a key federal agency called, abbreviation is SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And that one focuses a lot about mental health. And so they'll do a lot of feel-good programs of making sure people are happy. And happiness is fine, but that's not what our mission should be when it comes to healing people. You don't heal people from happiness. You help to heal them from their suffering and their dilemmas and their traumas. So as a nation, health is being able to function day to day, deal with the stresses that are inevitable, understanding that things are inevitable and some things you have to accept and get over it. As much as you may not want the sun to rise in the east and set in the west, it's going to happen. And there's going to be stresses. What's the great saying? Stress is mandatory, misery is optional. And that's what mental health is. Mental illness is when the body is really breaking down. It can be a biological system like a bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, where the brain is simply not functioning correctly anymore. The person can't think right. They're delusional. They may have paranoia, hallucinations, a number of issues there. It could be PTSD or depression, where the person is overwhelmed with depression, anxiety. The brain is misfiring in those things, and the person is no longer able to really function healthily on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, and they deteriorate. So that's a layman's distinction between the two.
So what are some of the big obstacles that you are trying to achieve with this article? What are you trying to nail down here?
What I'm trying to nail down is there's this federal agency which has lost its way. When I was chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, we uncovered really a lot of financial abuses where the organization, SAMHSA, was really focused more on keeping people out of hospitals and keeping people away from mandatory treatment instead of getting them treatment. We have seen big increases in people with severe mental illness being in jail, being homeless, suicide rates, homicide rates, being victims of crime, being perpetrators of crime, because people without mental illness, especially schizophrenia, have a terrible time getting through life. And in fact, this organization wouldn't even deal with schizophrenia. They didn't even have the word schizophrenia or bipolar in their annual reports. So I work to have this reformed by saying, we need a leader of this organization who was a psychiatrist or psychologist, and they had a lawyer before, and someone who's really focused on mental illness and healing mental illness. Well, they're still not doing that. There's a lot of things about improving access to the LGBTQ community. Okay, everybody should have access. There's things about having counselors in schools, or they have a push for the trans community to help them, but still no mention of really how do we improve care, professional care, for people with severe mental illness. What happens is without this, the costs are skyrocketing. An organization I'm part of called Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance, it's a mouthful of a word, but doing a study, and it looks like our preliminary data for the 2024 cost of schizophrenia, just as one disease alone, it's about 1% of the population, is about $380 billion. 1 year. And most of that cost is because we don't take care of them. We don't provide proper care. We don't provide proper training for people to do it. And when you look at the homeless population, about 30% of them have a severe mental illness, 30%. And anytime a city says, well, we're going to work on the homeless, they don't take care of them. They take care of those who are the temporary homeless, the people who are maybe having a hard time, can't afford an apartment, struggling to get a job. Okay, those are important. But city after city, state after state ignores those with severe mental illness. And I think Jesus said something about that if you ignore those in prison and don't take care of the homeless and don't take care of the poor, what you've done to the least of my brothers, you've done unto me. So we're hurting people by ignoring them.
Okay, so I don't want to be over broad in my thinking here, but is it true that most inmates, jail, or even prisons suffer with mental illness?
Yes, a majority of those in state penitentiaries have some level of mental illness. If you include substance abuse and acute situations, probably close to 90% of the inmate population and homeless too. But of those who are in prisons, state prisons, 40 to 60% will have substantial mental illness. Now think about this. They have trouble functioning day to day. They are probably in jail in the first place, in part related to a number of difficulties. I mean, there's no definition of normal that includes murder and holding up someone at gunpoint. These are serious, serious problems. And, in many cases, you have to separate those people from society. I'm not saying let them out. But the problem is we don't provide treatment for them. About 80% of those with mental illness don't get treatment at prison. Many of them don't get medication. They may then get riled up, have an acute psychiatric crisis, get in a fight with a prison guard. Now they're put in solitary confinement for a month. The worst thing you can do for someone with schizophrenia. Oh, it may sound tough, but that's a terrible situation. Like telling a person with cancer, we're going to punish you by not giving you chemotherapy. It doesn't work. And so I'd say the compassionate thing to do is, some people have to be separated from the others in society for safety, but we ought to be providing treatment or there's not much hope when they get out, if they get out.
To that point, Dr. Murphy, what I'm hearing you say is maybe describing if a vast percentage of the people, inmates in prison or in jail, suffer from mental illness and there is no treatment, then we're just throwing gas on the fire, so to speak, and they're there because they've committed a crime, but they're not being treated for why they committed that crime. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish the crime, but the point being is, if there's no treatment going on, wow, this is a boiling pot.
Exactly. And when we look at the recidivism rate of those who return to prison afterwards, I treat some people who have been in prison. And when they come out, they have a terrible time trying to find a job. No employer wants to hire them because they're concerned about liability risk, et cetera. So they have menial jobs. They can make a lot of money. But they want to many times really support their family. The people that they know are other former prisoners or the people they hung out with before. It's tough to start a new life. And so you see that without the treatment before, if they're still struggling with delusions, hallucinations, and groups that say, you know, we should never force someone to get psychiatric care if they don't want to, that's very, very troubling. And so the person then will continue that cycle of this brain disease, in some cases, particularly with schizophrenia, where it's a huge struggle. Now, as a population, look at some things that have happened recently in history. People are familiar with the case in the New York subway where Daniel Penny put someone in a chokehold, and unfortunately that man died. Neely. And people look upon, well, Penny shouldn't have done that, and he gets charged with manslaughter. And they talk about this, the gentleman who died, as being a homeless street performer. They rarely mention he's a man with untreated schizophrenia. Why was the city of New York and the county and the state not working to make sure he had care? Well, in part because there's groups out there that say we should never force someone into care. There's also a case recently in New York where a man stabbed 3 people randomly. Also a man described as homeless, but also a man with schizophrenia who was not being treated. Look at the case in Maine. 18 people killed a year ago by a man who was an Army veteran, and they looked at him, why would a veteran do this, and gun control, et cetera. He was a man with a lot of traumatic brain injury and having psychotic hallucinations and breaking down. The Army should have forced him into more hospital care, but many times under Medicare, you can only put a person in for 2 weeks. It's a colossal failure of the rules of the system where, once again, if he had been treated, things probably would have gone a lot better. And the case finally in Las Vegas just occurred of the Green Beret who shot himself and blew up his truck in front of the Trump building in Las Vegas. We've been able to read much of his writings. A very depressed, struggling man who's very concerned about the moral injury of what he had been engaged with this war and wanted to bring attention to that, but also a man screaming out in pain and depression, feeling that it had broken down, he couldn't do anything anymore. Wow. So you add all these things together and you see how that pattern goes on.
Wow. All right, that explains a lot. So I don't want to be too simplistic here. How do we go about treating this? How do we, let's just hypothetically say if you find somebody that's suffering from mental illness, schizophrenia, do you start with medication? What do you do?
Well, if you can get them into treatment period, and that's oftentimes it, the person has, about 40% of those with schizophrenia have a condition called anosognosia. And those who have a relative with Alzheimer's or dementia may recognize this too. It's when the person does not realize they're ill. You could say to them, no, there are no voices talking to you. The FBI is not standing at the front door hunting you down. These things aren't true. But they'll say, oh, if you don't experience it, you must be part of the conspiracy against me. And then they get paranoid. But the idea is they don't realize they're sick. And then with that, when you try and convince them to take medication, get care, they may avoid it, saying, oh, no, you're trying to plot against me. That's the paranoia that goes with it. We shouldn't be angry at them. We should try and understand. Now, there's some groups that say, well, you should try and convince them and help them to understand to take their medication. Well, that's all well and good, but many times they've had so many bad experiences or they've gotten violent and the police have come over. They don't trust people. So here's what needs to happen. Sometimes you need to get a person into a hospital for a few weeks to get the care they need to stabilize them and stabilize their medication level. But the way laws are written in many states is unless the person is in imminent danger of harming themselves or someone else in that moment, you can't keep them in a hospital. So even a person who is psychotic may be able to keep it together long enough to say, look, I'm okay now. I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm going to be fine. And the doctor's saying, well, we don't have any beds anyways in our hospital. There's no room to put you. So we'll put you out on the street and please make an appointment with your doctor in the morning. Well, they don't follow through and the crisis continues. So a big part of that is we need a system that's willing to have people, sometimes against their will, when they don't understand, get care. 2, we need beds and places to put them. We have shortages of tens of thousands of those across the country. We need judges who are trained to help with these people in mental health courts. We need psychiatrists and psychologists trained to help people who are psychotic. Many get zero training and don't really work on it at all and have a naive understanding of what takes place. And the families need support. This is quite frankly where a lot of churches can be extremely helpful. It is a crisis of finances, of faith, and love for many families who are dealing with someone who is severely mentally ill. That person is often dependent. They're living at home. The family may live in fear. They don't know what's going to happen to their finances, everything else. And they need a lot of support, not just a cursory prayer, but really reaching out and prayer through action to help these families because they're really struggling.
Fascinating. All right, let me take a quick break. Dr. Murphy has a website, drtimmurphy.com. There's a picture of the landing page, and his book called The Christ Cure, 10 Biblical Ways to Heal from Trauma, Tragedy, and PTSD. There's a picture of the cover of the book. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and always an honor to have with us. Dr. Tim Murphy's back with us today. He's a licensed psychologist. He's authored a book which truly is an amazing resource called The Christ Cure, 10 Biblical Ways to Heal from Trauma, Tragedy, and PTSD. This is an amazing resource. And then he has a website, drtimmurphy.com. Dr. Murphy, during the break, I was trying to figure out how to ask this question, but it seems today that mental health or mental illness seem to be on the rise. And is there a cause for this surge, or has it always been there and we're just now dealing with it?
There has always been mental illness in our society, in our world. In any given year, about 20% of the population will experience symptoms strong enough that could be diagnosed as mental illness. Not all get help. And that ranges from mild anxiety and depression, which we all feel at times, to something very severe and debilitating. What has happened in the last few years is large increases in suicide rates, depression, and anxiety disorders. It's a very troubling society we live in, and people don't really feel that they have the same sort of resources and connections. The connections is really important. If you were to see a bar graph over time of where people spend their time in the last half century, or more, maybe 60 or 70 years, you would see that prior to World War II, people spent most of their time with family, some at school, and some with friends, and a lot with church. Over the decades, what has happened is the time spent has reduced among many people to about 2 to 5% of a person's week. And time with family has reduced to about 5 to 10% of the week. Time with friends has gone down. What has gone up greatly is time online. And that could be at work at your computer, but it's also going through social media and being addicted to Instagram or TikTok or on-screen pornography, whatever it is. People are not interacting with each other. And now, as artificial intelligence, AI comes up, you see commercials on TV where people have problems. They're actually sitting there consulting with their computer. Are you kidding me? They're talking to a computer program and saying, I feel better because this program is telling me I'm a good person, and here's how I handle my problems. That's ridiculous. It'll get worse and worse and worse. I'm a big believer that the loss of time spent in religious worship and prayer has been a big factor for anxiety and depression. Now, prayer in the Bible is not a cure for schizophrenia. I want to make that very clear. You just can't say to someone, well, you need to pray more. But the everyday problems we have in our life, we can face a lot of those a lot better if we do spend some time in prayer. And I don't mean just saying, well, I believe. But it really is studying and spending time on this. I mean, we spend more time maintenance with our car, for example, than we do sometimes maintenance with our soul. So it is a very important part. And there's a spectrum of care we have to pay attention to. But to answer your question originally, are we seeing an increase in depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicide? Absolutely.
To your point, and I want to say this carefully, but what an amazing opportunity for the church to become a family and not just a place you go. I mean, I realize churches can mistake motion for progress, but are they a family? And is the family healthy? Because if there's healthy sheep, it produces healthy sheep. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Regardless of the denomination, a church that is healthy and helps build people's relationship with God and relationships with one another, it isn't just going up, it's going out too, right? It's the width, the breadth, the length, all those things together are part of building that strong family relationship. And churches can be a marvelous place for that in a big part, especially among Christianity, because a lot of it is built on a foundation of love and forgiveness. I don't know anybody who doesn't struggle with mistakes they've made in their life. And it could be feeling that they were never right connected with their father, their mother, their brothers, sisters. They're estranged from family members. Someone else in the family has been involved with some problems, or individual themselves. People are begging for an understanding to deal with their guilt and their shame. And forgiveness is part of that. And isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful that a key part of what Jesus has taught us is forgiveness? That it's in the Lord's Prayer that he taught us. It's in a key feature that he tells the apostles. He's corrected Peter with that too. We have to forgive one another. It's a very, very tough thing to do. But when we struggle with those day-to-day things that just gnaw at our heart, our soul, our life, our spirit, because of the guilt and shame we feel, what Christians, what churchgoers can do is offer to each other that forgiveness. And let me say this too. I'm not talking about forgiveness in general. I'm talking about forgiveness in the specific. Because there's places we may find that someone say, well, yeah, we should forgive one another, but I'm not going to forgive you. I'd like to forgive everybody, but I'm not going to forgive my father, mother, brother, sister, ex-spouse. No. God forgives. Others might, but I must. That's part of the healing process. It's not easy, but it's going to be part of our healing process. When we get to that level, we can forgive other people too and really welcome them into our own heart.
Dr. Murphy, it appears that the issue of health is going to be a front and center issue of the incoming administration, especially with the potential appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Seems to be pretty convicted here to clean up the food source and other things. What's your take on that?
Well, we do need to clean up the food source. We've ignored it long enough. The stuff we put on our bodies, read the side of a package and see what's in there. You can't pronounce most of those things. And that does not include the insecticides, pesticides, and herbicides sprayed upon plants that are then become our food source, sprayed upon the plants that the animals eat as well that become our food source. There's a lot of things in that whole process. In the European food process, they don't add those chemicals in. I know when I've been to Italy, for example, and I eat a pizza there or spaghetti there, you don't feel the same as I eat it here, because over here it's got all kinds of other chemicals in it. So I applaud him for doing that. Now, do I think that those are the cause of mental illness? No. People say, well, let's get rid of red food dyes and it's going to get rid of autism. No, that is not as simple as that. There's a number of issues going on there. But that's a big part. I don't want that to just be the only emphasis. And one of the reasons I wrote this article, by the way, that article you were referencing is on my website, drtimmurphy.com. Okay. That is I want him to pay attention to whoever he appoints as the Assistant Secretary of Mental Health, a position I created in my legislation. Whoever he appoints better be someone who's ready to get in there and work really hard. And I mean, this is going to be like turning over the tables of those who are involved with money changers. It's going to be that tough. And in my article, I said it has to be someone with the determination of a Teddy Roosevelt and the compassion of a Mother Teresa. This has to be someone who's really ready to go in there and says, we're not going to be spending money or going on these wrong directions anymore and just talk about the soft side. We're going to really have to work hard at this and hold governors and mayors accountable. Don't just tell people who are homeless, well, this is the best it gets. We're going to give you a new tent, a food cart. We'll hand out blankets, maybe open up City Hall on cold days. It's going to take more work than this. And I'm hoping that the new Secretary Kennedy really, really pushes for this and makes it happen. And that voice, by the way, one of the things I think, too, is there's an organization within SAMHSA, which is we've called the Interdepartmental Serious Mental Illness Coordinating Committee, big name. But what that means is from the Department of Health and the Veterans Affairs and HUD and all these other organizations, be represented, say, how are we going to take care of these issues together? What's the solution? There's one more group that needs to be included in that. And that's the President's Council on Faith-Based Initiatives. There needs to be someone in that room who's also talking about that we know that veterans get better, that people with anxiety and depression get better, that the homeless get better if you also allow religious groups and faith to be part of that solution. Not everybody has to be the same religion. I'm not taking favoritism on that because the government can't do that. But to allow that to also be part of it, that's part of the solution here. We've been told that biblically. We've been told that that's the law we're told to live by. So I'm hoping that these are also things that the new Secretary Kennedy advances within that. I'm hoping President Trump sees that's an important initiative.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Are lobbyists part of the problem here? I mean, I'm hearing you talk around influence and things, and we need to cut all this stuff off and get to the core. How are lobbyists playing into this?
Well, they're part of the problem and part of the solution. They're part of the problem if they, in a case where a lobbyist only look at their narrow band. So, look, I understand pharmaceutical companies want people to take their medication. I get that. Right. But not everybody needs just medication. They need other things as well. Right. There's psychiatric and psychological groups that have their niche. There's other mental health groups, or some support more hospital beds and some don't support more hospital beds. And that's why a legislator has to take all these things into account and work on it. But lobbyists can also be helpful of getting a word to members of Congress, the House and Senate, to say, here's issues that's important to work on. But let me say this, the best lobbyist is you. Each and every person who's watching this, listening to this, is the best lobbyist, to make sure that you take a few minutes to send an email over to your legislator and say, mental illness treatment is important to me. Please do these things. I would say, take a copy of that article that I wrote and send it to them, because that really lays out in that article, which is entitled Make America Mentally Healthy Again, is one that lays out here's some acts that needs to be taken. But every individual should be a lobbyist for the cause you believe in. And if you believe that the government should get out of the way and stop telling people of faith that they're not allowed to practice, say that as well. You're the best voice. Everybody listening to this is the best voice for pushing those issues and helping people be informed. We've been pushed aside for too long. We've been told for too long we can't speak up on these issues. We have to let men and women's sports, we have to let men and women's bathrooms, we have to put up with these things. No, we don't have to. We can speak the truth.
That's so good. All right, you can get a copy of the article. Read it there at drmurphy.com. There's a picture of the landing page. Click on that. Make America Mental Healthy Again. And check it out, drtimmurphy.com. Dr. Murphy, thank you, friend. Good to see you. Look forward to many visits. And thanks for your tenacity to stay in this thing and get something going. God bless you, my friend.
You bet. I won't give up. Thank you. God bless.